All right. So what I was saying is that we know the issues. We know what transformed, what was the main driver in this in the results, and we also know that some of the things that we perhaps didn't suspect of Hispanics. These are Florida Hispanics. When you see this, for example, what is the main issue of Florida Hispanics? Curiously, right? Border security and illegal immigration. Number one issue among Hispanics in our survey, something that we frankly didn't expect. All right. Um, and but this is where I was going. We asked, and we've been asking this question for the last 5 years. Have you changed parties in the last year? And what we found is that this statistic has been growing increasingly from about 10% about 8 years ago, about 7 years ago, pardon me, to 15.5% this time around. And again, in Florida, it's pretty significant that among Hispanics, right, when we ask them, well, which of the following best describes how your party affiliation changed, right? This very large number tells us that they switched from the Democratic to the Republican Party, and or from Democratic to Independent. We now know, as a result of the exit polls, that independents trended in Florida toward the Republican Party. So just if you look at these two figures, you've got over 50% there who affected the outcome, right, of those who say that have changed. Now, this is a figure that, by the way, is also national, right? So if you calculate about 15% of the 36 million Latinos in the United States, that's a little bit over 5 million Latinos who say that over the last year they changed political parties, right? Remember my statement about a switch of 2 to 4%, right? That's over 4%. So it's a very significant move that has occurred over the last year or so, despite the fact that most Latinos in the United States and in Florida still believe that the Democratic Party represents their values and that they identify as Democrats before Republicans. But that figure is now under 50%. So that is a very significant sign of what has been happening nationally in Florida, and most importantly to the Democratic Party. Okay, so that's, I think, sort of the setting, that in many ways impacted what we just witnessed. So having said that, then let me move this forward a little bit and note this question here, right? The most effective way to combat illegal immigration is to conduct large-scale raids of undocumented immigrants and mass deportation, right? So here you can see the enormous agreement with this policy, right? That if you just simply add agree and strongly agree, you've got over 40% of Hispanics in agreement with this particular policy. So again, a very strong identification with the platform that now President-elect Trump announced here in Hialeah, right, in November of last year. So a year ago, he gave a speech in Hialeah that said exactly this, to massive applause of an audience made of predominantly Cubans, Colombians, Venezuelans, etc. So that tells you a little bit. So this overview kind of then tells us, right, where we are, right, and all of these things, of course, you've looked at, right, that we're no longer a swing state. We've known that for a while. That the Republicans have an absolutely firm control over the state, and that, of course, our support has dropped considerably across Florida and across all counties, basically, right? But we also know that there is a road to recovery, but that road to recovery is a very steep one. So here I want to just kind of go over some of the data, right, and sort of look at what I think some of the more important dimensions of what we should be focused on over the next few months and years. Uh, the landslide created this enormous statewide transformation, right? So strongholds like Miami, like Hillsborough and Osceola flipped, and then the margin narrowed in places like Leon, Broward, and Palm Beach, right? I mean, this is fairly clear, and you can see this in just about every study that has been done, especially the the exit polls. Now, if we look specifically at Miami-Dade County, right, I stole this from the Miami Herald, nice graph, which sort of tells you where in Miami-Dade County it's, this is just the consolidation of something that we have been studying for years, right? But you can see that even in those areas that are still somewhat strong Democrat, the margin has dropped considerably, such that even in areas where at one point we were comfortable, right? The transformation has really occurred there, so that it'll probably be at least another cycle before Democrats can make any kind of inroads in this county. Now, having said that, I want to share with you our Cuba poll, which Professor Grenier, my colleague, revealed in October. And he was in October, he told us, right, that 68% of Cuban Americans would vote for Donald Trump, right? And this contrasted very much with the surveys that our own Democratic pollsters had been doing in the county. You may recall some of the polls that were published that even showed that Vice President Harris had a 14-point margin over Donald Trump in Miami-Dade County. So this I think is we only kid ourselves when we have polling that doesn't reflect what's really going on in the county or in Florida, right? And that was one particularly a significant moment. By the same token, if you look at the same survey, right, this is in a sense how party affiliation has changed over time in Miami-Dade. And here we see something interesting and why there is hope in terms of recovery, right? Uh, there was a moment in which Miami-Dade County was on the verge of exactly splitting, right, among Cuban Americans. 50% of Cuban Americans were identifying as Democrats. And, this is around 2014 to 2016. Really very interesting moment. So now, if you look at this particular graph as a sort of an example of how public opinion is so volatile or perhaps malleable, you can see here that in 2016, for example, right, on issues like the embargo on Cuba, right, it dropped down from 60% to 34%, right, who favored the continuation of the embargo. And 72%, these are Cuban Americans that we were surveying, favored opening diplomatic relations with Cuba, right? Very significant in terms of what that meant for voting in Florida, in Miami-Dade County in that year. But you can see what has happened in the 8 years since, and in particular, right, since 2020, where we're now, of course, we're essentially back to where we were at the beginning of the century, right, on both counts, and it'll be this is a particularly important indicator of how how Cubans vote. Now, so here's the broader picture of Miami-Dade County historically, right? So again, you can see where Democrats did make some significant inroads, right? But yet now that whole transformation that was occurring has essentially now gone back to where it was. It's in fact much worse than what it was uh, uh, at the beginning of the century. So Miami-Dade tells us something, right? That you can see these public opinion shifts, and that Democrats can make some inroads in Miami-Dade County. And that's obviously in some measure a question of the times, but there are other issues which I'll get to in a moment. Now, if you look at it statewide, right? This is also something quite interesting. If you look at these two counties, Hillsborough and Osceola, you'll see on the right what Hillsborough tells us, right? That in 2020 we thought we were doing okay, but the difference wasn't that great, right? It was only a 48,000 difference. In 2024, right, the Republicans now have a 20,000 vote advantage, right? And if you look at the difference on the other side between 20, just on in Democratic votes, we've lost 54,000 votes in Hillsborough County alone. If you look at Osceola, while we haven't lost as many votes, we still lost that county. And we lost that county by 2,500 votes. So, but that's a transformation that has occurred there. And you can look at very similar data in Pinellas and Duval and Hernando and also in Polk and Pasco. So this tells you something. It's still relatively close. But since, close doesn't matter, right? This is a winner take all system. If we're going to lose, we don't get proportionality here. So we have to win straight out, right? Now, if we look at the counties that Democrats actually retained, right, there are some interesting characteristics there. In Leon County, for example, of course, in large measure, it's the fact it's not only Tallahassee, but it's FSU, right? The presence of FSU is there. And so that tells you something about young people and the significance of working with young people. And Gadsden County, right, which is a very African American county, the importance of working the African American vote is, and that Gadsden should tell us, even though it's very small, we should be thinking about, engaging African American voters in a better way than we did this time. And Alachua County, of course, is largely because of the University of Florida as well. So there are some common themes there, right? Universities and the importance of young people in their identification with the Democratic Party. Now, but here's another issue that all of you are familiar with, right? The erosion of democratic strongholds. Now, I should say before I go further that Broward remains a very important county to study post-elections, and I'll get to this in just a moment, right? These are, of course, the traditional strongholds, but the results there tell us something quite significant. That especially in Palm Beach, the results were extraordinarily close. Extraordinarily close. We almost lost Palm Beach, right? But not so in Broward. And in Broward, it appears to me that Broward has been doing some things right in terms of three issues that I have been, and Lourdes will laugh when she hears me say this again, but since about 2017, I have been saying that Democrats have not been doing three things correctly, or they haven't been doing them. Number one is starting late. All right. In every campaign cycle, Democrats always start late. Number two, Democrats take communities for granted, right? And this is probably the most important one, right? That if you start late and then you take communities for granted, that's not a very good equation. And then number three is we have bad candidates that have few linkages to the communities in which they work. And this is probably an indictment of Miami-Dade County more than anything else, but it probably applies elsewhere. But it's not really the story of Broward. In Broward, it seems to me, especially when you look at the candidates and when you look at how the candidates have performed there, that those are historic candidates with some deep roots that performed well. I'm not sure if you began earlier than elsewhere, but probably, right? And maybe the relationship, for example, that I can see, for example, of somebody like Marie Woodson at the state level, and the fact that she has this enormous engagement with her community, tells you why somebody like that is being sent back to Tallahassee.
She
So
got 80% of the vote.
exactly. So I think those three things that I've been saying for a long time are important as a as we move forward. So let me say, what are the factors that are behind our collapse then? One is the delayed campaigning, right? Which I said just a moment ago, right? We don't maintain a year-round presence, right? We tend to ramp up our efforts in the very last months leading up to an election. And so it's very difficult to counter Republican narratives, and it's very difficult to build lasting relationships. And more importantly, it's difficult to recruit good candidates. There clearly has been a Hispanic voter realignment, right? And some of the things that we've been looking at for a few years now, I'm going to just focus on the Puerto Rican vote, for example, the Puerto Rican vote in Osceola, which might have been those 2,500 votes that kept us from winning Osceola, right? Uh, the Republicans have been courting the Puerto Ricans since at least 2016, and they have been spending time with them. They have been doing things in that community. We saw it in a survey that we presented in 2018, and which was not well received, by the way, but where we basically saw how close the relationship was between somebody who's not a very simpatico person, then governor and now Senator uh, um, Scott, and the Puerto Rican community. Puerto Ricans identify with Senator Scott. That is something, very interesting to explain. And I think the only explanation it has is that he's worked them and he's worked them hard, right? Let me just point something else out outside of Florida. Uh, in the week leading to the elections, uh, you all remember how that joke had such an impact on the media, and it had such an impact on the way in which people were addressing Puerto Ricans, right? Especially the way we thought, right? The way we thought that when Trump threw those paper towels at Puerto Ricans, that was going to be enough for Senator Nelson to defeat Senator Scott. This time we thought the joke will move Puerto Ricans over to the Republican, to the Democratic side. But what we didn't realize is that Senator Rubio had spent the last few months going to Pennsylvania on several occasions and staying there and courting Puerto Ricans in Allentown and in other cities in Pennsylvania. In other words, candidates have to take the time. I think we began to notice Puerto Ricans after the joke, not before the joke. So again, I think it's an important thing. There is a realignment, but it has to do with the fact that Hispanics are responding to candidates that come and show up and promise at least to do things for them. Okay, all right. Um, there was a significant suburban shift. We know that, particularly in Hillsborough and Duval, right? What are the concerns there? Yes, crime, education, but inflation primarily, right? That drove everybody toward Donald Trump, right? And then, of course, there are some significant turnout challenges that we faced throughout Florida and throughout the United States, let's be fair, including African Americans, including young people, right? And even including, let's call them his progressive Hispanics, right? And so, this is what exacerbates Republican gains, right? And then finally, what I said before, candidate weaknesses, right? Candidates with very few community ties or candidates with no ability to inspire enthusiasm, right? And the difference is when we do a study, especially again in Miami-Dade County, and this is where I live, so this is what I know best. But as much as one can criticize some of the candidates that the Republicans field, these are candidates that are very deeply enmeshed with their communities. And so it's working the constituency, being present, and having those deep community ties, right? Now, so what are the lessons? And I'll end in a couple of minutes. Uh, I think there's some critical lessons here for us, right? And number one is we need to. I think it's right now we need to think about something that Democrats have talked about for a long time, right? And you know this. There's books written on this. We need a Florida permanent campaign strategy. We need to be able to engage voters year round, not just during the electoral season. We need to develop grassroots organizing. We need to improve the quality of community events. We need to rebuild trust, right? We can't counter Republican narratives if we don't have a presence, if we're not constantly campaigning the way they are, in fact, right? The second thing, and since I work on the Hispanic communities, I think we need to improve the messaging to these communities. Our Florida Hispanic community is very diverse, right? I mean, just a variety of concerns, a variety of priorities. We have to be able to nuance those messages, right? And what are the messages that we're finding? We're finding that among voters, Hispanic voters are increasingly behaving like the average elector, right? Especially when we look at US citizens who are second and third generation, right? That they're looking at things like economic opportunity, they're looking at public safety. But you know, what's interesting is that you have to be able to distinguish between a Cuban, a Venezuelan, a Colombian, and a Puerto Rican. So you have to be able to do that. But at the same time as you're doing that, right? And this is something that some of your colleagues have been really pushing for a long time. Um, we have to, in Florida, be able to distinguish between our Hispanic community and the community that is in New York or the community that is elsewhere, which might be more open to a different kind of messaging, right? I mean, I hate to bring this up, but you know, the way in which we address Cubans, right? We can't address Cubans, especially when you saw those slides, right? When we're talking to them about progressive values, or where we're talking to them about negotiating with Cuba, or we're talking about things like lifting the embargo and so on. The data tells you that that's not a message that's going to resonate. At the same time, we can't talk to Venezuelans, right, about lifting sanctions on Nicolas Maduro and so on and so forth, right? So these are things that really need to be tailored. And the only way you can tailor them is if you have a presence there, you have context with them, and if you understand the logic of public opinion in those communities, right? Now, at the same time, you know, it's important to reconnect with suburban workers and to recover the working class. I mean, I don't know how many papers and essays and op-eds I've read in the last couple of weeks about how, you know, the Republicans are now the party of the working class, right? That is quite striking. And in part, I tell you this as a professor, right? It seems to me that we, as the Democratic Party, have been communicating to voters the way I communicate with my colleagues in the faculty lounge, right? We have to understand that faculty lounge politics does not go very far in an election cycle like this one, and probably like the next one's coming. So how do you rebuild trust with a working class unless you go back to understanding some of their specific concerns, right? I think we need to invest in candidate recruitment. And this is, to me, at least, again, looking at it from Miami-Dade, we have to field stronger candidates. We have to find relatable candidates. We have to find candidates that are rooted in the community, and not, we can't bring in people and just kind of parachute them in at the outside. And that also, by the way, goes with parachuting in very, very talented consultants from other parts of the country, right, who don't really understand what's happening here. And then finally, of course, there's an absolute need to mobilize the base among those core Democratic constituencies that we have taken for granted, right? And so it's permanent registration drives, grassroots organizing, and messaging that energizes these groups. Okay, so let me finish there, and I hope I haven't bored you too much or insulted you too much. So let me stop there.